Growing up, I always felt like an outsider in my own family, like there was an invisible barrier around me through which I could observe everyone else's lives but not truly be a part of them. My name is Jody, and I'm the youngest of 4 children, and for as long as I can remember, I was the last to have everything, and often not at all. Amy, my older sister, was 5 years older, and even her old clothes seemed luxurious to me, even though I knew a cousin in Minnesota had worn them before her. And the elbows of those sweaters were paper thin. I remember sitting on the floor by the bed, darning sleeves with mismatched thread, and my mother would walk by and say over her shoulder, "Just make it last a little longer, Jody, you're a crafty girl." And when it came to electronics, oh, my God, it was like a taboo subject. By the time my brothers and sisters' old phones and laptops reached me, they looked like they'd been through a war. My phone had been cracked for so many years that I'd stopped noticing the shards of glass leaving fine scratches on my fingers when I tried to type messages. One night at dinner, while I was trying to find the moment while my parents were discussing everyone else's progress, I gathered my courage and quietly said, "Mom, my laptop keeps shutting down when I'm doing research. Can I get a new one for my birthday?" I looked straight at Dad, but he didn't even look up from his plate, just said curtly, "Those things are expensive, Jody, we can't afford them right now." And the next weekend, they brought home a brand new gaming laptop for Tyler. He needed it for graphic design. I said nothing, I just nodded, as if that was logical, but something inside me crunched softly, because it wasn't the laptop, or the phone, or even the dresses after Amy, it was that I felt invisible. Every family dinner was the same. Jake got an A on his engineering project, Amy led the volleyball team, Tyler showed off his work for the school exhibition, and I sat at the edge, picking at my food with a fork, waiting for someone to suddenly turn to me and ask, "How are you doing, Jody?" But no one asked. When parent-teacher conferences approached, Mom and Dad would put on a show, preparing like it was a holiday, cookies, smiles, outfits, for my brothers and sister, and the only time they showed up for my conferences was when the school called to remind them that the teachers hadn't seen them all year. I tried not to be offended, telling myself that maybe they were just busy, but my heart still ached. But what they didn't notice was that I'd finally found something I truly felt like I belonged in. Chemistry. It was like falling in love, with molecules, with formulas, with how something new is born from simple substances. There was something magical about it, yet understandable. I entered every competition I could, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't just the junior, but someone capable of more. After class, I'd stay in the lab, breathing in that special smell of alcohol, copper, and glass, and every time, I felt like this little world of test tubes and reactions was my own home. When Mr. Roberts, our advisor, approached me after I won first place at the regional science fair and said, "Jody, your solution to that problem was truly innovative. Have you ever considered studying chemistry in college?" I couldn't answer right away. I'd been thinking about it for a long time. Every day, at home, I tried to repeat the experiments in my room, saving on everything, babysitting for neighbors so I could buy simple reaction kits online. One day, I was conducting a harmless demonstration of catalytic decomposition when my mom knocked on the door. "Jody, what's that smell? Open up this instant." Her voice was sharp as a match. I opened the door, and she wrinkled her nose. "This has to stop, the whole house stinks. What if your dad brings in clients?" I wanted to explain that it was just a safe reaction, but at that moment, Tyler walked by and giggled, "My little sister's cooking meth, should I call the police?" I clenched my fists and snapped, "Shut up, Tyler," but my mom turned sharply, "Don't talk to your brother like that. And clean all that up right now." That evening, I silently packed away my test tubes and flasks, carefully wrapped my small reagents in a towel, and realized that if I wanted to continue, it couldn't be here, so I began conducting my experiments at Grandma Ruth's house, the place that smelled of cinnamon, old wood, and freedom. Unlike my parents, Grandma Ruth was genuinely interested in what I was doing. She didn't just pass by like everyone else, pretending not to notice my interests. She was truly there when I needed her most. "Tell me about it, Jody," she'd say, peering over my shoulder as I carefully weighed solutions in an old, battered glass. She didn't rush me, just sat there and asked questions, so simple and yet so important. Grandma Ruth became my true ally. The kitchen table in her house, covered with a grimy tablecloth, became my lab bench. She sat with me for hours, helping me document my results, offering her ideas, supporting me in moments of doubt, and most importantly, she was the only one who truly saw me, who didn't turn away, who didn't treat me as just one of many, forgotten in the crowd. And so, in my last year of high school, I had a clear plan. I planned to graduate with honors, enter the chemistry department, and eventually work in a real lab, where everything would perhaps be just as I'd imagined: glass flasks, reagents, graphs, spreadsheets, my life. I never thought of it any other way. I watched my parents support my siblings, taking out loans, applying for grants, using their retirement savings to cover Jake and Tyler's education costs. Amy, who received a partial athletic scholarship, wasn't left without support either, but when I sat down in front of them, full of pride and confidence, after receiving my acceptance letter from State College, I was completely unprepared for their reaction. College? Dad looked genuinely confused, as if I'd suggested he go to the moon. I didn't think you were going. I felt a chill wash over me. Why wouldn't I go to college? I asked, stunned, cringing with confusion and bitterness. Mom shrugged, as if it were obvious. We never talked about it. We thought you'd just find a job after graduation. It was like a slap in the face, not so much from the words as from their indifference. I'd been talking about becoming a chemist since my freshman year. I'd won a state competition. I thought they'd remember that. How could you not know that? I couldn't bear it. My parents exchanged glances, and a drawn-out silence hung in the air. Chemistry? Mom finally said, as if repeating a mantra, do you even understand what that means? The words sounded like I was discussing something insane with them. I couldn't believe my ears. I'd been so involved in my research, participating in competitions, going to exhibitions, setting up experiments at Grandma Ruth's house, and all of this wasn't worth the slightest bit of attention? Look, Dad said softly, as if explaining something to a younger child, we spent a lot of money on your brothers and sister. College is expensive. We simply don't have anything left for you. These words hit me like a physical blow. We simply don't have anything left for you. And in that moment, I realized that this was the essence of my life in their eyes. All this time, I had been in last place. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply fell silent. Something inside me tightened, like a taut rope, and I knew I wouldn't ask anymore. I wouldn't hope anymore. Okay, I said, getting up from the kitchen table. I'll figure it out myself, and so I did. I applied for a partial scholarship to State College, using my academic achievements. It was a small victory, but at least something. The next day, I went to a cafe near my home and applied for a job. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for help that wasn't there. My dreams for the future demanded action. The next day, I went to Grandma Ruth's and asked if I could move in with her after finishing school. I didn't know how else to survive. The transition from high school to college was not easy. I packed my belongings, which weren't many, and moved into Grandma Ruth's spare bedroom, working at the cafeteria. I earned minimum wage, but every dollar went toward my college fund. I worked double shifts and returned home with aching feet and the smell of coffee grounds, but I didn't care. One thing mattered. I was moving forward, despite everything. Grandma never complained about my presence. Despite the chaos I created in her house, the dining room became my makeshift office, and the kitchen table became a place where I prepared lab assignments and studied chemistry theories. Grandma would bring me tea late at night, while I was still hunched over my textbooks, and gently suggest that I take a break. She was the only one who always believed I could handle it. When the fall semester at State College began, reality hit me like a cold shower. While other freshmen were attending orientation parties, decorating their dorm rooms, and making plans for the coming year, I sat at my desk in my small room in Grandma Ruth's apartment, calculating how many hours I'd need to work to afford my textbooks for the next semester. My partial scholarship covered about 60% of my tuition, but there remained a huge gap that none of my hopes could fill. I couldn't afford to squander a single penny on anything unnecessary. After the first week of classes, when I realized my money wouldn't support the workload, I made a decision. I needed to find additional income. The cafe where I worked in the evenings wasn't enough. The problem wasn't just money. I realized that my parents, even if they could help, had already spent all their savings on my brothers and sister. I had no one to rely on, and if I wanted to achieve anything, I had to act on my own. Absorbed in thoughts and planning, I forgot about holidays and get-togethers with friends. My world had become small, confined to textbooks, lab assignments, and a course schedule that I could barely fit into the empty spaces of my life, and so, seeking refuge, I approached Professor Larson, my general chemistry instructor, right after class, with a hesitant but insistent question. "Excuse me, Professor, I was wondering if there were any openings for students in your department, anything related to employment and training?" He looked at me through his glasses, his gaze attentive but without much interest, like that of someone unaccustomed to small requests. "Perhaps, what is your background?" he said, and I felt a chill in the question, as if something was wrong, but my determination overcame all doubt. I told him about my experiences participating in chemistry competitions and the independent projects I'd completed back in high school. At that moment, his expression changed, and I thought he was genuinely interested. It was more than just polite interest. "Come to my office tomorrow, I might have something for you." His words, like a last hope, gave me the strength to move on. Those somethings turned out to be two part-time positions. One was as a lab assistant, helping prepare materials for students' labs. The other was shelving books in a science library. I naturally chose the former, despite the fact that it would have meant extra hours, more fatigue, and less time for personal matters. But I had no choice. I had to earn money. Between classes, work, and the occasional shift at a cafe on weekends, I barely had time to sleep, but for the first time I felt like I was building something for myself. It wasn't an easy path, but I walked it with the feeling of being closer to my goal, even if it was distant and unclear. My apartment with my grandmother became a true refuge for me. Every evening, when I came home to a nearly empty city, I would find her carefully prepared dinner in the refrigerator, which she would leave for me no matter how late I got home, and I knew that despite the fatigue, despite the hardships of school and work, my grandmother always supported me. In the kitchen, she would leave me little notes that read, "Remember to breathe, Jody," or "I'm so proud of you." These simple words were my saving anchors in the darkest moments, when I doubted, when it seemed like everything was falling apart and there was nowhere left to go. At night, when my head was spinning with fatigue, I immersed myself in my studies. In lab work, in chemical reactions, as if I myself were becoming part of the processes I was studying. Chemistry was no longer just a hobby, it had become my true future, my goal, my escape from a world where no one believed in me except my grandmother. It was my proof that I could be more than my parents thought. I studied on buses on the way to university, read textbooks during lunch breaks, and solved problems late into the night, falling asleep on my grandmother's old sofa in her guest room, knowing that a new day with its assignments and office hours awaited me in the morning. Professor Larson noticed my dedication. He began giving me more challenging assignments and inviting me to attend advanced classes. And finally, one day, after lab work, he stopped me and said, "There's a student research conference next semester. I think you should present a project." These words simultaneously terrified and inspired me. I didn't know where to begin, how to present my project. I asked, "What kind of project is this?" And his answer got me thinking. "Something original. Something that interests you." He handed me a stack of scientific journals. "Start reading, look for gaps and unanswered questions." From then on, I spent weeks poring over research papers, jotting ideas down in a notebook, where each new day brought new thoughts and solutions. Eventually, I settled on researching a new catalytic approach to breaking down pharmaceutical compounds in wastewater. It was something with real-world application and built on my strengths. My days became even more chaotic, but I felt the project beginning to take shape. The initial results were promising, showing that my method was more effective than existing methods, and despite how difficult it was, both physically and mentally, I knew one thing: this was my chance. When I presented my findings at the freshman symposium, I was more nervous than ever. I was as nervous as before a big exam, but deep down I felt ready, that my data, my research, wasn't just a bunch of numbers and reactions. It was my work, my soul, poured into every line. I knew every parameter, every experiment, every result, and at some point, when I started speaking, when my words resonated with the audience, I realized I was worth being there for. But what followed my presentation stunned me. One of the professors, an older man in a formal suit, looked at me carefully, smiled, and said, "Outstanding work for a first-year student." He raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Where did you learn these techniques?" I didn't immediately find an answer, but simply whispered, in high school, and then someone else, a department chair, quite prominent at the university, pulled me aside, his face serious, almost solemn. "Jody, we don't often see this level of sophistication in students. Would you be interested in presenting at the regional conference next month?" I immediately agreed, without thinking. Something important, truly important, was unique to me, and I was ready to take on even more. I had no idea how I would squeeze it all into my already overcrowded schedule, but maybe that's exactly what I needed. Maybe this was my chance, my only opportunity, and I couldn't pass it up. Somehow, I managed to find time to prepare for the regional conference. It was much larger than any I'd ever spoken at before, and far more intimidating. Most of the participants were graduate students, a few were renowned professors, and I was just a newbie, the youngest person in the room. In the moments before I began, my voice trembled and my palms were sweating, but I knew I was there for a reason, that I deserved to be heard. When I began my presentation, things weren't going perfectly. I faltered at first, getting confused by the slide transitions, but the content was solid, the evidence irrefutable. When I finished, and the room fell silent, I was literally bombarded with questions, but I was prepared. I answered each question clearly and confidently. Even when faced with criticism, they were skeptical, trying to catch me out, embarrass me, but I stood firm as never before. I saw their attitudes change. They began to respect me, even if they disagreed with every conclusion I made. At the end, a woman approached me. Her face was familiar, but I couldn't place her. "My name is Helena Rivera, and I'm from the University of Eastridge," she said with a smile that was impressive work. My heart beat faster. I was standing in front of a woman who was associated with one of the most prestigious educational institutions. "Thank you," I managed to say, my fingers sweating. "We should talk about your future plans," she continued, and I felt my world instantly shrink. She handed me a business card. "I'd be interested in hearing more about your research." I couldn't believe this was actually happening, that someone with that name and title was interested in my research. I was stunned. All this time, despite my efforts and successes, I'd barely shared my progress with my parents. They hadn't called me once since I moved to university, never asked if I was alive. Occasionally, I'd see photos on social media of family dinners, holidays to which I wasn't invited. Yes, it hurt, but with each passing month, the pain became less acute, less tormenting. There were too many other concerns. As my first year at university drew to a close, my project began to grow, to expand. Professor Larson began devoting more time, resources, and opportunities to me. He introduced me to his colleagues as a rising star, emphasizing my potential. I wasn't used to being noticed or called a future star. It was something new and strange for me. By the end of the spring semester, I had a 4.0 GPA, a promising research portfolio, and an invitation to work in Professor Larson's lab that summer. The dean's office even notified me that I was eligible for an additional scholarship for academic excellence. Everything was looking up, and it seemed like my efforts were finally beginning to bear fruit. But it was then that the call that changed everything. I was washing glassware in the lab when my phone vibrated on the table. "Dr. Rivera from Eastridge." Her voice was so confident, so professional. "Jody, I've been following your work," she said, and it literally took my breath away. "We have a special transfer program for exceptional students, a full scholarship starting in your second year. You'll work directly with our research staff." I felt my thoughts racing, my life flashing before my eyes. Eastridge was more than just a university. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to work with leading scientists, an opportunity I'd never even dreamed of. But what could I do? I couldn't refuse. I asked for time to think. When I told Professor Larson about the offer, I expected to see disappointment, maybe even hurt, but instead, he smiled broadly. "You'd be a fool not to accept this, Jody. This is what you've worked for." I couldn't help but agree. That night at dinner, I told my grandmother the news. She leaned across the table, squeezed my hand, and tears glistened in her eyes. "Your grandfather always said that the cream rises to the top," she said proudly. "He would be so proud to see you now." 2 weeks later, I accepted Eastridge's offer. I didn't even immediately realize I hadn't told my parents. I didn't need their approval. It seemed I couldn't wait any longer for someone who couldn't see me, couldn't hear my words, to feel like I truly existed. As I packed my things, stuffing clothes and books into my suitcases, I suddenly realized it had been a long time since I'd told anyone about my successes. Hadn't shared my accomplishments, my scholarship, my transfer, all of it was mine. And I was proud of it, and yet, something hurt in my chest. Maybe I wanted the one who left me to see me now. But it was too late. Eastridge had become my new home, the university that had given me everything I dreamed of and more. The campus was incredible, spread across acres of manicured lawns, ancient buildings with tall columns and stone paths that seemed to remember the footsteps of great scientists of the past. It was the kind of world I could only dream of in my small room at another university, dimly lit by a lamp and overloaded with books. In the chemistry department, I saw equipment I'd only read about in magazines. Reactors, spectrometers, lasers. I was absolutely delighted, but at the same time, I was overcome by a paralyzing thought. I was too small for all this. My apartment, provided to me through the scholarship program, was small but modern. It was the first place I could call my own, and it felt truly miraculous. For the first time, I felt like I truly belonged here, but work was difficult. I'd transferred to a university where students were expected to be impeccable, and I quickly had to adjust to Eastridge's high standards. I spent most of my first semester poring over my textbooks. At night, when the lab was empty and the street was as quiet as ever, I hung on every word, every sentence, trying not to miss my one and only opportunity. My classmates, with their incredibly successful backgrounds, from prestigious preparatory schools, with parents who were doctors and professors, seemed completely different. I was ashamed of my story and preferred not to reveal it. Vague answers, avoiding personal questions. That's how I navigated this new stage of my life, as if trying to hide in a crowd of successful and competent people. However, despite all this, the highlight was Professor Nathan Harris, who became my academic mentor. He was a man of such repute that his name was whispered, almost as if it were sacred. Twice nominated for the Nobel Prize for his work in catalytic chemistry, he left no one without seeing just how skilled he was. When I first walked into his lab, I was so nervous I could barely speak. He didn't even look up from his microscope, but his voice was firm, almost stern. "You must be angry," he said, looking at me through his glasses. "Helena says you have exceptional talent. Show me." It was the moment I realized I was on the verge of something much bigger than just a university project. But to justify his trust, I needed to work hard, much harder than I ever imagined. He pushed me harder than anyone else. He criticized my methods, questioned my assumptions, constantly sent me back to the drawing board, as if I were still a beginner, as if I needed to learn all over again. But it was under his strict guidance that my research began to transform. What initially seemed like a simple student project turned into something much more ambitious and innovative. I learned not to be afraid of mistakes and to find answers in them. By my third year, I had already authored 2 papers published in respected scientific journals. I presented at conferences across the country and even at an international symposium in Berlin. Each new success felt like a step further from that invisible girl who once struggled to find her place in the world. Grandma Ruth remained my only link to the past I had left behind. We spoke weekly, and I brought her to visit me twice a year. She was proud of my achievements but always told me not to share the news with my parents. I made her promise to remain silent, and she kept her word. She displayed photographs of me in a lab coat on her mantelpiece, and every time I looked at them, I felt her pride. But when I received an email from the university communications department at the beginning of my 4th year, I wasn't prepared for what it meant. A science correspondent for National Public Television wrote that he wanted to feature my research in a segment about young scientists. The producer had read my latest paper and thought it would make for an interesting story. My first instinct was to decline. For years, I'd avoided the spotlight, focusing all my energy on lab work and scientific papers. Public speaking wasn't on my radar, but Professor Harris, noticing my hesitation, persuaded me to reconsider. "Science isn't just labs and papers," he told me, putting down his papers and looking straight into my eyes. "It's an inspiration for the next generation. Think of the young woman watching this segment and perhaps seeing herself in you." The film crew arrived early in the morning, while fog still clung to the campus paths, and for 3 days they practically lived next to me, filming me as I walked into the lab with a cup of coffee in my hand, checking my results on the screen, teaching a class of freshmen, trying to explain to them the very magic of chemistry that had once changed my life. They asked questions, asked me to imitate movements, laugh, look up, and it all seemed strange, almost unnatural to me. After all, I was used to being behind the camera, not the center of attention. But then they interviewed Professor Harris, and when he, sitting in his office among piles of papers and diagrams, told the camera that he considered me one of the most promising young minds in modern chemistry, I, standing outside the door, couldn't believe he was talking about me. It was the recognition I'd dreamed of my whole life, not from my family, not from those who always looked the other way, but from someone who actually saw my work. They also filmed me receiving the Hawkins Prize for Young Scientists, a prestigious award I'd never told anyone about except my grandmother, Ruth. I remember her voice shaking with pride when I called her that evening. "You see, my dear, it was all worth it." The segment aired on Tuesday evening. I watched it alone, perched on the edge of the sofa in my small apartment, a frozen cup of tea in my hand, and everything on the screen seemed somehow surreal. The reporter's words sounded almost alien. A rising star of chemistry who has made significant contributions to pharmaceutical waste treatment and sustainable recycling methods. They showed me in the lab. Then clips from my conferences, articles, and quotes from professors, and suddenly I saw myself, not the girl who once asked for a new laptop and was turned down, but a woman standing confidently in front of the camera, a sparkle in her eyes, talking about science, about the future, about what I believed in with all my heart. When the episode ended, I turned off the TV, then the phone. I knew what would happen next, and sure enough, the next morning, when I opened the screen, I saw a message from an unknown number. "Jody, we saw you on TV yesterday. Your dad and I are so proud of you. We always believed in you. Call us, we miss you." I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. 3 years of absolute silence, and now they were proud, now they missed me. My fingers trembled, not from excitement, but from fatigue, from seeing those same words again. Too late, too empty. I deleted the message without replying. Over the next few days, the messages multiplied. First, from Amy, a long letter filled with childhood memories, words about how the family was incomplete without me, how they all wanted me to come back. Then from Jake, a short, awkward one. "Congratulations, Jody. Hey, my daughter's in the science fair, could you help her with her project?" And finally, from Tyler, a simple note under the video. "This is my little sister." I didn't even know whether to laugh or cry. Now that I was on TV, now they suddenly needed me. I ignored it all, but the pain, strange, deep, welled up inside again, like an old wound that had never truly healed. The final straw came a week after the broadcast. I posted photos from my graduation. My grandmother stood next to me, beaming as I held my diploma, her face so full of pride that it seemed to brighten everything around her. A few hours later, comments started appearing under the post, dozens, then hundreds. Relatives I barely remembered wrote, "We are all so proud of you. Our family pride. You are the jewel of our family." And then I saw a comment from my mother. It shone above the rest, as if it had been written especially loudly. "This is what happens when you have parents who support your dreams. We are so proud of our little one." The audacity took my breath away. I stared at the screen, feeling a wave rise, hot as lava. I wanted to throw the phone, hurl it at the wall, scream, but I just sat there, quietly, gritting my teeth, until the tears of anger and hurt dried. Then, with trembling hands, I opened the page and wrote a short message. "Graduation is at my house this Saturday. It's going to be amazing." I didn't include the address. The phone rang a few minutes later. "Mom," I knew it was her even before I looked at the screen. I slowly picked it up. "Jody." Her voice sounded too cheerful, too fake. "We're so excited about your party. What's the address? We need to book tickets ASAP." I took a deep breath. "You're not invited," I said calmly. A pause, a silence in which I could almost hear her blinking in surprise. "What?" "Jody, don't be silly, we're your family." "Family?" I chuckled. "You refused to help me with my education. You said I was hopeless. You didn't even know I was studying until you saw it on TV." "That's unfair." Her voice wavered. "We've always supported you. Everything we did was for you, the children." "For 3, I interrupted, "not for the 4th. How can you say that? We made you who you are." A laugh escaped my lips, dry, searing. "No, Mom, I made myself who I am, in spite of you, not because of you." "That's outrageous," she said, and her voice took on that familiar cold edge again, the same one from childhood. Outrageous, I repeated quietly, is when you do nothing and then want to take credit for my work. No, Mom, you can't finish the race and pretend you ran it. I hung up before she could respond and stood in silence, feeling the storm in my chest gradually subside, leaving behind only a clear, solid calm. Then I turned off the phone, put it away in a drawer, and immersed myself in preparations for a celebration that truly mattered. Not a showy one, not one that garnered likes or proud comments, but a real, vibrant celebration filled with laughter, warmth, and the people who had been there all these years while I was rebuilding myself, step by step. Graduation day was almost unrealistically beautiful. The sun shone in a clear sky, a gentle breeze ruffled the jasmine branches by the fence, the air filled with the scent of spring and something new, a promise of change. I rented a small venue overlooking the garden, modest but cozy, with white tables, lanterns under the canopy, and flower arrangements I'd chosen myself the day before. Grandma Ruth arrived early, as always, with a boxed pie and that same look of pride that always made me smile. No matter how tired I was, she hugged me tightly, with that maternal warmth I'd once missed, and after examining the decorations, said, "Well, now it's really your day." By 6 o'clock, the room was filled with familiar faces, colleagues, friends, those who had been with me from the very beginning, who had seen me without makeup, without confidence, in a lab coat stained with reagents and with dark circles under my eyes from sleepless nights. Professor Harris arrived with his wife and a bottle of champagne. Dr. Rivera, the one who had once been the first to believe in my abilities, appeared with a smile and a bouquet. Even my former roommate at Eastridge brought her fiancé to introduce him to me. There were no more than 20 people in all, but each of them was part of my journey, the real one, not the televised one. The phone rang all day, messages, calls, social media notifications, relatives argued in family chats about who was right, who was wrong, who should have been invited. My siblings seemed stunned at being excluded, and distant relatives wrote entire posts about family values. I didn't read a single one. This wasn't a day for them. During dinner, when the air was filled with the clinking of glasses and the aroma of baked salmon, Professor Harris stood up, tapped his glass with a spoon, and attracted everyone's attention. The room immediately fell silent. He spoke slowly, with that calm that always conveyed strength. "I've been teaching for over 30 years, he began, and during that time I've had many students, brilliant, hardworking, creative, but it's rare to find all these qualities in one person." He turned to me, and I felt my cheeks heat up. "Jody," he said, "you possess a rare combination of talent, persistence, and resilience. And resilience," he paused, "is what makes a true scientist. In science, everything begins with failure, and only those who know how to persevere eventually make discoveries." He raised his glass. "Therefore, I proudly announce that Jody will be joining our research faculty next fall as a full-time research fellow in my lab." The room erupted in applause. Some cried with joy, others burst into tears. And I stood there clutching my glass, feeling tears welling up in my eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. Working in the Harris lab wasn't just an offer, it was a dream, a recognition, a pinnacle I'd been stumbled toward, stumbling, falling, yet still continuing to walk. As the evening drew to a close and the last guests began to leave, I noticed the professor at the door, talking to someone. He caught my eye and beckoned me over. My heart sank. For some reason, I immediately thought of my parents, their possible arrival, the unpleasant scenes that would ensue. But as I approached, I saw neither my mother nor my father, but a girl with short blonde hair, hesitantly holding a gift. "Hi," she said quietly, "I hope you don't mind me coming. This is Ellie, your cousin." I blinked, remembering Ellie, Aunt Meg's daughter, with whom I'd barely spoken since I left home. "Of course I don't mind," I said, smiling sincerely, "I'm glad to see you." She sighed with relief and handed me the package. "I saw your posts and just wanted to tell you in person how wonderful this all is. You're inspiring, I really do." I hugged her, and the hug felt pure and real, without ulterior motives or expectations. After the party, when everyone had left, I returned to my apartment. My legs felt pleasantly tired, and my heart a quiet, steady sense of satisfaction, as if everything had finally fallen into place. The next morning, I woke to the vibration of my phone, dozens of new messages, but one immediately caught my eye, from Professor Harris, my office, 11 o'clock, important. I pulled on my jacket, pulled my hair into a bun, and left, not expecting anything special. But upon entering his office, I immediately realized something was wrong. He stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, looking unusually confused. "Your parents came to see me this morning," he finally said. My stomach sank, as if icy fingers were clutching it from within. "What?" I breathed out. "They showed up unannounced, right in the lab," he said slowly. "They said they couldn't contact you directly, they wanted to talk." He paused, watching my reaction, but I couldn't utter a word. The air around me seemed to thicken, and all I could do was stand there and listen as the past gently knocked on my door again. I closed my eyes, feeling a strange, bitter embarrassment clench inside me, not at the professor, not at my parents, but at myself, for the fact that part of me still longed for something different, something human. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, looking down. "I didn't know they'd do that." Professor Harris raised his hand, gently but firmly. "No need to apologize, Jody," he said. "I simply told them I don't discuss my researchers without their consent." He paused and added with noticeable sadness, "They looked desperate." I chuckled, but not with laughter. "They were desperate for the wrong reasons," I replied quietly. 2 days later, they appeared anyway, like a shadow from which it was impossible to escape. I was cataloging the specimens, focused on my usual work routine, when the secretary called on the intercom and said, "You have visitors." There was something wary in her voice, as if she sensed the coldness these people brought with them. For a moment, I almost told them to say I wasn't there, that I was busy. But then something in me made up its mind. How much longer could I hide? It was time to meet face to face. When I entered the reception area, there they were, my parents. My mother looked older than I remembered, the skin under her eyes darkened, her hair dull. My father was hunched over, wearing an overly formal jacket, as if he'd come for a job interview and not to visit his daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 3 years. They stood next to each other, unsure how to act. And this awkwardness reminded me of the times I'd returned home after exams, complete alienation disguised as familial politeness. "Jody," my mother spoke first, stepping forward as if she were about to hug me. I didn't move. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. My father cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze. "We wanted to talk to you, alone. If possible." I led them into a small conference room that smelled of coffee and paper and closed the door behind me. "Go ahead," I said. "Why did you come?" They exchanged glances, like children caught in the act of doing something embarrassing. My mother spoke first. "We're having troubles," she began cautiously. "Financial, the mortgage, medical bills, and your brothers. And Amy, they're going through a tough time right now." I nodded, feeling an icy calm creeping within me. "And you thought I could help," I prompted. My father quickly intervened. "We saw you win the award on TV, the one with the cash prize. We thought maybe." He paused. "Maybe you could help the family." The word family rang like a lie. I chuckled, quietly, mirthlessly. "Family?" I repeated. "I wasn't family when you refused to sign the tuition guarantee. I wasn't family when I worked nights to pay for books. You didn't call or write for 3 years. But now I'm suddenly your daughter again because I have money." Mom raised her hands, as if trying to justify herself. "It's not fair, Jody," she said, and there was a familiar note in her voice, the same one she always used to make me feel guilty. "Everything we did was for you, the children." "No," I interrupted, feeling the cold turn to steel. "Everything you did was for the 3 children, not the fourth. You said it yourself." My father slammed his palm on the table, losing his composure for the first time in the entire conversation. "We made you who you are," he shouted. The laughter that escaped my lips sounded bitter, almost painful. "No," I said, "I made myself, despite you, not because of you." Mom burst into tears, the same tears I remembered from childhood, the tears she used to get her way, back when I still believed love could be earned through obedience. "How can you be so cold?" she whispered. "We gave you shelter. Grandma Ruth gave me shelter," I replied calmly. "Professor Harris was my mentor, and you were an obstacle I overcame." I stood up, making it clear the conversation was over. "I don't owe you anything," I said. "Not money, not forgiveness, not a relationship. And if you still remember the word boundaries, then please respect them. Don't call or write anymore." I walked out, leaving them sitting in that silent room, and paused for a second in the hallway, allowing myself to take a deep breath. Perhaps it was cruel, but it was the truth, pure, painful, but mine, they came not out of love, not out of pride, but because they needed something, and I finally understood, some things never change. Since then, my life has flowed peacefully, the lab flourished, the project expanded, encompassing new areas. I began working on environmental solutions for restoring polluted water bodies, and for the first time, I felt that my work wasn't just scientific, it was alive, meaningful. I recently made a down payment on a small house, cozy, surrounded by lilacs, purchased through a grant program for young researchers. Grandma Ruth often comes to visit, and each time she brings homemade pies and fresh stories about the neighbors. Some cousins have also responded, not for profit, but simply to be close. Truly, I'm rebuilding this relationship carefully, on my own terms, step by step, without pressure, without pretense. As for my parents and my siblings, I don't know how they're doing, and, frankly, I don't need to know. I let them go, and with them, the girl who once dreamed of earning love. Now I have nothing more to prove. I live, breathe, create, and finally feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be.